another person called me up and asked me to come and look at a large tree. He suspected it was an elm in his backyard. And so I went out to Cundard Road, which is just off of County Road 45, Wilden Avenue, heading northwest out of town, and went into the backyard, and here was this gigantic elm tree, and I stood under it, and I tried to comprehend the size of this tree and how it could be that it was living, and apparently so vibrant. And the reason that I was struck with this is that in the 1920s, a fungus was accidentally introduced into North America that over the following 40, 50 years really essentially wiped out all of the elms in the eastern part of the U.S. And continues to kill them off. In fact, last year, an American elm tree just outside our house, in the matter of 3 weeks, just died. And it's Dutch elm disease is what kills them. And it's what I expect to happen to elms. So here, the large tree in the center is this elm tree. I arrived at Mr. Lindhorn's house, and I stood under this gigantic elm tree, just flabbergasted that it was there, and it was so healthy and so alive. You know, I talked with Mr. Lindhorn about the tree and about his family that had lived here in this house for 40-some years. And I was also kind of piecing together that just across the railroad, just across the highway from this elm tree is the site where the old Cundard gladiolus farm had been, you know, which was something that began at the end of the 19th century. Amos E. Cundard began hybridizing gladioluses and ended up creating this business that distributed flower bulbs, gladiolus bulbs, all over the U.S. and all around the world, sold them to royalty in Europe. The mail going in and out of Goshen in the 1920s and 30s, half of it was accounted for going out of this gladiolus farm. So this elm tree began to grow about the time that business began to grow. And Mr. Lindhorn's family came here in the 1960s, and he raised his family there underneath this tree. And I can only imagine that the reason it survived is that it must have been somewhat isolated from other elm trees in the area for some reason, and so never came into contact with Dutch elm disease, or that it had some genetic resistance, and there are individuals like this. I mean that we're aware of these, but I was not aware of any in Goshen or in northern Indiana. There probably are some others, but this one really caught me off guard. And I ended up writing an early piece for the newspaper, just about encountering this tree and about his family living with it. You know, so it became this micro story about this tiny property and this singular tree, and the way that it lived here on the outskirts of the Maple City, now surrounded by the Maple City. Maybe part of the reason also that it survives is because as the Maple City, we were busy planting maples instead of elms like everybody else in the eastern part of the United States. And so there were fewer elm here to act as a draw for the fungus. The end of the story, or maybe not the end of the story, is that this spring the tree was cut down, and I was vaguely aware that this was a possibility. The property had been sold. The Lindorns had died, and the property had been sold. The daughter got into contact with me from Utah to say that she was aware that the new property owner was likely to cut this down. She wasn't asking me to intervene, but just wanted me to be aware, knowing that I had been interested in the tree. And indeed it was cut down. Before I took the time or made the time to at least have a conversation with the new property owner about the tree and why it is unique, why it's important. So I feel some guilt about not having been on the ball to at least have a conversation. I don't know that I could have done anything about what happened, but the tree is now gone, and I don't know. Well, right, the limbs are still scattered roughly in the drip line of the trunk. The stump sits there, and it's so badly scarred by the chainsaw that I can't even count the rings. But I'm guessing it's about 100 years old, in that range. But the daughter she was able to get the majority of the trunk and is having several pieces of furniture built out of it, including a table. The micro story is about this tree. The macro story is about Dutch elm disease that continues to persist and to wipe out elm trees that try to make it back, is pushing up into Canada as climate change pushes things north. I was in Winnipeg a couple years ago, where my wife is from, and Winnipeg claims to have the largest urban elm population in the world, and it's amazing. I'd never seen an elm tree streets lined with elms before until going to Winnipeg, and it's a cathedral experience to walk down a street that is lined with elms, and it wasn't here in Goshen, but many other places in this part of the country. Once upon a time, the macro story is how the forces of economics and globalization, before that's what we called it, brought a fungus that wiped out the elm, and of course 40 years before that, it was an earlier version of the same thing that brought a fungus to North America that wiped out the chestnuts, and in the 1890s, and then more recently, in around 2000, the same thing was repeated with a bug that was introduced from Asia that has wiped out our ash trees. And so we wonder what's next. Here as the Maple City, we've dodged 1 bullet, 2 bullets, 3 bullets, but when is it going to be maple? And what are we going to do about that as the Maple City? But more importantly, as a community that has this story of caring for trees and being identified with trees, whether they're maple or otherwise, and so that's kind of the next wrinkle in our story that we have to see how it plays out.